The gavel came down before I finished my sentence. I had been speaking for 11 minutes. 11 minutes to represent 8 billion people, for centuries of civilization, and every dream humanity had ever carried into the stars. The chamber was vast, a curved bowl of white stone that seated over 300 delegates from 112 species. The light inside it was pale and even, as if the architects had designed it to make everyone look equally unimportant. I stood at the center podium, and the gavel came down, and the conclave arbiter, a tall gray creature called Velsorin, spoke in that flat, translated voice that made every word sound like it had already been decided. The motion passes. The Sol system is hereby quarantined. Humanity's access to galactic relay infrastructure is revoked. A boundary marker will be placed at the outer edge of the heliosphere within 30 standard days. Delegate Solano is given 48 hours to transmit the verdict to her government. That was it. No arguments. No appeal. No second vote. I stood there with my prepared speech still half unread on the lectern and looked out at 300 alien faces, and not one of them met my eyes. Not even Ambassador Velthura of the Vethkura, the species who had vouched for humanity's entry into the community 61 years ago. She was looking at a point somewhere above my head, her long fingers folded neatly on the table in front of her, her expression completely still. I had been the Earth delegate for 9 years. In that time, I had negotiated 7 trade agreements, attended over 200 formal sessions, and learned enough of 6 alien languages to greet people in their own tongue. I knew this chamber the way. I knew my own home. I knew where the acoustics were best, which seats had the warmest light, which species liked to be addressed by title, and which found it rude. And none of it had mattered at all. I picked up my papers, physical papers, because I had always believed a printed speech showed respect, and I walked out of the chamber without waiting to be dismissed. The corridor outside was long and white, and smelled faintly of something like fresh rain. 2 of the conclave's protocol staff moved to escort me, as if I might do something unexpected. I didn't. I walked to the transit pod at the end of the hall, stepped inside, and told it to take me to the human delegation suite. The suite was on the 47th floor of the station. It had a wide, curved window that looked out at the stars. 3 junior staff members were waiting for me: Owen, Petra, and a young man named Cal who had only joined the delegation 6 months ago and still got excited about seeing alien ships through the telescope on the observation deck. They looked at my face, and none of them spoke. I set my papers on the table. I sat down. I looked at the window for a moment, and then I said, "They voted us out." Owen, who was my senior aide and had worked with me for 7 years, sat down slowly across from me. Petra put her hand over her mouth. Cal looked like he wasn't sure if he was allowed to ask questions. "How many voted in favor?" Owen said. "I didn't stay to hear the final count." "What were the formal charges?" I had read them so many times in the weeks leading up to the vote that I could recite them without thinking. Biological unpredictability, pathological ambition, cultural contamination of 3 seedling species. I paused. That last one is the one that actually bothers me, because it means the Dorith, the Soon Lie, and the Mirren Collective have been developing in ways the Conclave didn't plan for, and they've decided to blame us for it rather than consider that maybe those species were simply ready to grow faster than the Conclave's schedule allowed. Owen said nothing. He knew I was right. He also knew that being right had not helped us. "I have 48 hours to transmit the verdict home," I said. "What do you want to tell them?" That was the question, wasn't it? I had spent 9 years on this station representing humanity, and now I had to call home and explain that the community of stars we had spent generations dreaming about had looked at us, deliberated, and decided we were too much trouble to keep around. I thought about my mother, who had cried when humanity first made contact with the Vethkara. She had been 11 years old, watching the broadcast in her school classroom in Wellington, and she said the whole room had gone completely silent and then completely loud all at once, and it had felt like something had changed in the world so fundamentally that everything before that moment seemed like it had happened to a different species. I thought about the 50 million people who worked in galactic trade, the research stations, the joint science programs, the cultural exchange missions, The children born on this very station whose whole sense of home was this place, this community, these corridors. And then I thought about something else, something I had noticed in the chamber when the gavel came down. Not one of them had looked surprised. Not one face in that room showed the faintest trace of uncertainty or regret or even relief. They had been certain of this outcome before I spoke. The vote had been decided before I walked in. My 11 minutes at the podium had been a formality, a courtesy extended not to me, but to the official record. They had never thought of us as equals. Not once. Not in 61 years. I opened my transmission console. I entered the secure channel for the Earth Council of Delegates. I waited for the connection to stabilize across the relay, and when the light went green, I said clearly and without any emotion I could not afford to spend right now. This is Delegate Mira Solano. The conclave has voted to quarantine the Sol system. All human access to galactic relay infrastructure is revoked effective immediately. I have 48 hours before the boundary marker is placed. The line was quiet for a long time. Then a calm voice on the other end. I recognized it as Counselor Dean, a man I had known for 15 years, a man who had celebrated when I got this posting and who had once told me that my appointment as Earth Delegate was the proudest moment in the Council's history, said, "Understood, Mira. Come home. Just that. Come home. Not outrage. Not panic. Not a string of urgent questions about what we could do, who we could appeal to, what legal mechanisms existed within the Conclave Charter. Come home." I closed the channel and looked at Owen, who was watching me carefully. "They weren't surprised either," I said. He nodded slowly. "The Council has known this was possible for 3 years. There have been closed sessions. I wasn't supposed to tell you until it was necessary." I looked at him for a long moment. I thought about being angry. I decided I didn't have time. What were they planning? I said. Owen reached into his bag and pulled out a data tablet. He slid it across the table to me. On the screen was a project title, a budget allocation number, and a list of names I didn't recognize. Engineers, physicists, architects. The project was called Hearthstone. They started it 4 years ago. Owen said quietly, "Just in case." I looked at the numbers on the screen. The scope of what I was reading took a moment to fully form in my mind. The way a large building looks wrong until you're standing far enough back to see the whole shape of it. Then I understood. And for the first time since the gavel had come down, I felt something other than grief. I felt curious. Cal, who had been so quiet in the corner that I had nearly forgotten he was in the room, finally spoke. He was 23 years old and still had the expression of someone who expected the universe to make sense. "What happens now?" he said. I set the tablet down. I looked out at the stars in the window, the same stars I had looked at every morning for 9 years, the stars that held 112 civilizations who had just decided they were better off without us. "We go home," I said, "and we get to work." The transit pod that took me back to the human departure bay passed through 3 sections of the station where I had spent most of my adult life. The market hall, where Owen and I used to buy breakfast from a soon-live food vendor who had learned to make something vaguely like eggs. The science wing, where I had attended 100 joint seminars. The garden level, where 6 different planetary ecosystems were maintained in sealed chambers and visitors could walk through all of them in a single afternoon. I did not stop at any of them. There are moments in a life when looking back is simply not useful. This was one of them. When the shuttle broke away from the station and pointed itself toward the jump relay, I sat in the forward observation seat and watched the station grow smaller behind us. It was enormous, a structure half the size of a small moon, something humanity had helped build in part, something that had taken 200 years to complete and housed over 4 million permanent residents. We had contributed to it. We had worked in it, lived in it, been shaped by it. And they had decided we were too unpredictable to stay. Owen sat down beside me. He did not say anything for a while. We watched the station together until it was just a bright point among many. "The project," I said finally. "Hearthstone. How far along is it?" "Farther than you'd expect," he said. "How much farther?" He looked at me steadily. "The first independent drive test was 8 months ago. They didn't want to tell you because they were afraid it would affect your negotiations." I thought about that. I thought about standing at the podium for 11 minutes while the vote had already been counted, while the gavel was already in the air, while 300 species looked somewhere just above my head. It wouldn't have, I said. I know, he said, but they wanted to be sure. The relay gate ahead of us opened, and the stars stretched, and we went home. I did not cry. Not then. Crying felt like a kind of argument, and I was done arguing. I was done with all of it. On the other side of that gate, Earth was waiting. And based on what I had just read on Owen's tablet, Earth had been quietly, carefully, and very thoroughly preparing for exactly this moment. The conclave had given us 48 hours to leave. We were going to use every second. 40 years is a long time to be angry. I know because I tried. For the first 3 years after the quarantine sealed, I wrote detailed, formal analyses of the conclave's decision, cataloging every procedural error, every piece of evidence they had ignored, every argument that should have changed the outcome. I sent them to the council. The council read them, thanked me, and continued building Hearthstone. By the 4th year, I had stopped writing analyses and started writing something else entirely. Technical briefs for the engineering teams, based on my 9 years of direct observation of galactic relay infrastructure. I knew how the gates worked. I knew the frequency bands, the maintenance cycles, the signal architecture. I had watched the conclave's engineers repair and upgrade relay systems on 7 occasions. It turned out that was quite useful. By the 7th year, I had stopped feeling angry altogether, and that was when I knew the quarantine had actually worked, not in the way the conclave intended, but in a way that was far more interesting. It had stopped us from looking outward toward a community that didn't want us, and turned our full attention inward, toward what we could actually build. I am writing this from a station called the Farview Platform, orbiting Neptune at a distance of 4 million kilometers. It has a crew of 800. It was completed 11 years ago. When I arrived on the quarantine transport, 40 years back, this platform did not exist. This orbit was empty. The only structures humanity had beyond the asteroid belt were a handful of research outposts, most of them running on skeleton crews and outdated equipment. That was then. A young man named Keanu Marsh came to see me last week. He is 26 years old, born on Callisto Station above Jupiter, and he is one of the lead engineers on what the current generation simply calls the Outreach Program, though the official designation is considerably longer and involves a great many acronyms. He found me in the observation lounge on the station's upper ring, where I spend most of my mornings now. The view from there takes in Jupiter's edge on the left and the full sweep of the outer system on the right, and I have never grown tired of it. Keanu sat across from me, with a data pad on his knee and a look on his face that I recognized immediately. It is the look of someone who is genuinely puzzled by history. The young are often puzzled by history. They cannot quite understand why the people who lived it did not simply make better choices. I read your memoir transcript, he said. The section about the vote. And I said, I kept waiting for the part where someone stopped it, he said. Like, there had to be a mechanism. A legal challenge, an emergency provision. Something. There wasn't. He frowned. They just voted and it was done. They just voted and it was done. He was quiet for a moment. Outside, a cargo hauler was moving slowly across the orbital lane, its running lights blinking in the dark. It was enormous, far larger than anything humanity had operated 60 years ago. We built bigger now. We had learned, in isolation, that scale was not something to be afraid of. What did it feel like? Keanu said. When the verdict came down, I thought about that for a while. It felt like watching someone mispronounce your name at a ceremony where they're giving you an award, I said. Wrong and public and somehow very final. He smiled at that, though I could tell he was still working through it. I've never seen an alien, he said. It was not said with longing. It was said the way someone might note that they had never been to a particular city. Interesting, perhaps, but not something that had ever interfered with their life. That told me more about the past 40 years than any statistics could. Keanu's grandmother had marched in the streets when the quarantine was announced. His mother had grown up hearing stories about the conclave with a bitterness that flavored everything she said about the outside universe. And Keanu himself had simply moved on. He had grown up in a humanity that was building faster than it had ever built before, expanding into a solar system that turned out to be vastly larger and richer than anyone had seriously mapped. And the Galactic Conclave was something you read about in history modules between lessons on the early colony programs. "What are you working on right now?" I asked. His face changed completely. That puzzled expression vanished, and something lit up behind his eyes in the way that only happens when someone is about to talk about the thing they genuinely love. "Fold resonance calibration," he said, "for the third-generation independent drives. The first-generation drives were functional but rough. They stressed the whole geometry every time. Second generation solved the stress problem but had a range limitation, about 6 light years per jump. We think we've figured out the calibration model that removes the range ceiling entirely." "How close are you?" 2 months, maybe 3. "The math is clean. The simulation results are clean. We're just waiting on the physical test at the Neptune rig." He paused. "If it works the way we think it does, we can get to Proxima Centauri in about 4 jumps." I looked at him. "The Conclave's fastest relay ships take 6 days to reach Proxima." "I know," he said simply, not proudly, just factually, the way you might note that your new equipment is an improvement over the old. That was the moment I knew, with complete certainty, that everything had changed. Not because of what he had said, but because of how he said it. There was no triumph in his voice. Noble indication. He was not comparing humanity to the Conclave. The Conclave had simply become irrelevant to his frame of reference. He was comparing this drive to the previous drive, because those were the things that mattered. 40 years ago, humanity had looked up at the stars and seen a community that held all the answers. We had been grateful, eager, slightly desperate to prove ourselves worthy. We had brought gifts to every meeting. We had studied their languages and their customs and their histories with the kind of dedication that comes from wanting very badly to belong. And in the quarantine years, something had shifted so slowly and so completely that most people hadn't noticed it happening. We had stopped wanting to belong to that. Let me tell you what humanity built in 40 years of quarantine, because the list is the kind of thing that requires some patience to absorb properly. 17 colony worlds. Not outposts, not research stations. Actual settled worlds with permanent populations, governing charters, and local industries. The nearest is Kepler's Landing, 11 light years out, founded 22 years ago by a crew of 4,000 who used a first-generation independent drive to get there and spent their first winter in prefabricated shelters before the permanent habitats were ready. The farthest is a planet we call Blue Margin, 38 light years from Sol, a cold world with a thin atmosphere and no native complex life, settled 8 years ago by a crew that included, among others, 3 former members of the Conclave's Xenolinguistics program who had returned to Earth after the quarantine, and then spent the following 30 years doing something more useful. Ring habitats, 7 of them, distributed across the solar system from the inner belt out to Saturn's orbital range. The smallest houses 40,000 people. The largest, the Meridian Ring above the equatorial belt, has a population of over 900,000 and an internal ecosystem that has been running independently for 16 years. A Dyson swarm. I should explain this carefully because I know it sounds larger than it is. A completed Dyson swarm around Sol would take decades more to finish, and we have not finished it. What we have are approximately 14,000 collector units in various solar orbital paths, harvesting energy and transmitting it to the ring habitats and the outer stations. 14,000 units sounds like a great many. It is, by any measure that would have seemed realistic to the humans of a century ago. By the measure of what a complete swarm would eventually be, it is a beginning. But it is a beginning that works, that powers real things, that keeps real people warm and alive and moving through the darkness between planets. The independent FDL drives. This is the one that would have surprised the Conclave the most, if they had been watching closely enough to notice. They assumed, when they sealed the gate, that they were cutting us off from the only method of faster-than-light travel that existed. Their relay gate network was, as far as they knew, the sole technology that made interstellar travel possible in any practical sense. It had taken them thousands of years to build it. It was their most significant collective achievement. We reverse engineered the principles in 11 years and built something different in 14 more. I don't say this to diminish what the Conclave built. Their gate network is extraordinary, but they built it by expanding outward from a single method, a rigid, infrastructure-dependent approach that required a permanent physical gate at both ends of a route. Our engineers, locked out of that network and working from first principles in 11 years of observations I had made without realizing how important they would become, went in a different direction entirely. Ship-mounted drives. No gate required. No fixed infrastructure. You simply go. It is, I am told, fundamentally different in its underlying physics, which means the Conclave cannot simply copy our solution any more than we can copy theirs. The quarantine buoy the Conclave placed at our heliosphere's edge operates by pinging our end of the relay gate network to keep the connection locked. We discovered about 19 years into the quarantine that we had quietly drifted so far from needing the relay network that the buoy was essentially pinging a locked door to a house we no longer lived in. We had moved out. We had built a new house. The buoy was still dutifully sending its signal to a connection point that humanity's engineers had long since decommissioned and repurposed for raw materials. No one made a formal announcement about this. It was logged in a systems maintenance report noted by 3 engineers, and then everyone got back to work. I discovered the report 6 months after it was filed, while doing research for these memoirs. I laughed for the first time in years when I read it. Not a bitter laugh, a real one. Now, the alien probes. This is the part that Keanu had come to ask me about, though it took him some time to get to it because he is young and considerate and did not want to seem presumptuous. About 8 years ago, long-range sensors at our heliosphere perimeter began logging unusual pings from the outer edge. They were regular, structured, and on a frequency band that matched no natural phenomenon. Our engineers analyzed them and concluded, within a few weeks, that they were scan pulses from probe units operating in close proximity to the quarantine buoy. The Conclave was watching us, not communicating, not reaching out, just watching, sending automated probes to look at the edge of our sealed-off system and transmit back whatever they could sense. I found this deeply interesting, not because it suggested the Conclave regretted the quarantine. I did not believe that for a moment. They were watching us for the same reason a careful administrator checks on a sealed case, to make sure it stays sealed, to make sure nothing unexpected is happening. The unexpected was, of course, the understatement of the century. What the probes could sense from the heliosphere's edge was limited. They could detect energy output, and our output had grown dramatically enough to register. They could detect movement in nearby space, and the traffic patterns near the quarantine buoy were nothing like what they would have expected from a civilization in isolation. They were seeing numbers that did not make sense, and I suspected that somewhere in a Conclave office, someone was having a very uncomfortable conversation about it. Keanu finally asked his real question near the end of our session. He had been circling it for a while, and I had been patient because his circling meant he was thinking carefully, and thinking carefully is a trait I have always valued. In the drive test results from the Neptune rig, he said, "We've been logging the outer edge scans as part of the dataset. The probe density near the buoy has gone up about 40% in the last 6 months." "Yes," I said. "That means they know something has changed." "Yes," I said. "Are we worried about that?" I looked out at Jupiter's edge, still and massive and perfectly indifferent to everything humans had ever felt about anything. "No," I said. "We are not worried about that at all." Keanu nodded slowly. I could see him processing what that meant, not just the statement, but the tone behind it. He was smart enough to hear what I was not saying. He left about an hour later, back to his calibration models and his clean math and his 2 months, maybe 3 timeline for removing the range ceiling from human interstellar travel. I stayed in the lounge for a while longer. I thought about that chamber 40 years ago, the pale even light, the gavel, the 300 faces looking somewhere above my head. I thought about Velthira of the Vethkera, who had once vouched for us and then could not meet my eyes. Then I stopped thinking about it because there were more interesting things to think about, and the stars outside were very bright, and somewhere out past Neptune's orbit. 40% more probes than last season were trying to understand what on earth we had been doing with ourselves. I hope they were confused. I genuinely, warmly hope they were confused. Ambassador Velthera arrived at the outer perimeter of the Sol system on a ship that was beautiful in the way that only things built by very old civilizations with unlimited budgets can be beautiful. It was long and curved in pale gold, and it moved through space with a kind of unhurried grace that made everything around it look impatient by comparison. She sent a formal hailing message in the standard conclave diplomatic format. Request for approach clearance, statement of intent, credentials, and authorization codes, all very proper, all very correct. The message was addressed to the Earth Council of Delegates, Sol System, Human Civilization. My granddaughter Yara received it on a Tuesday morning while she was eating breakfast in her quarters on the Farview platform. She finished her breakfast before she replied. I know this because Yara told me about it later, and because she laughed when she said it, and the laugh was not unkind. It was the laugh of someone who had learned from a very young age that how you respond to a message matters as much as what you say in it. I acknowledged receipt, Yara told me, and informed her that clearance would be granted pending security review, and that review would be completed within 48 hours. Why 48 hours? I asked. Because that's how long they gave you to pack up and leave. I looked at my granddaughter for a moment. She is 31 years old. She has her father's eyes and her mother's way of saying exactly what she means in exactly as many words as are necessary. She had been appointed junior Earth delegate at 27 and full delegate at 29, which made her the youngest in the position's history and the only one who had never set foot on the old conclave station or met an alien in person before this moment. She was, I thought, precisely the right person for this. The Vethkara ship was given a parking orbit at 250,000 kilometers beyond the heliosphere marker and told that a reception shuttle would come to them, not the other way around. Yara made that clear in the most courteous possible language. For operational reasons, we ask that your vessel maintain its current position while we arrange transport for your delegation. Ambassador Velthera agreed without complaint. What else could she do? The shuttle that went out to collect her was a new model completed 8 months earlier at the Callisto yards. It seated 40, had a range of 6 light hours under independent drive, and could, if necessary, perform an emergency full jump to any of our 17 colony systems in under 2 minutes. None of this was mentioned to the ambassador. It did not need to be. She would see it just by looking. Owen had retired 12 years ago and was living on Kepler's Landing, sending me long messages about the weather and the orchards he was growing from seeds engineered for low-pressure atmospheres. But his daughter Petra, yes, named after my former aide, worked in the delegate's office now, and she was on the shuttle with Yara. She told me later that Ambassador Velthera, when she boarded the shuttle, had stood very still in the entry corridor for almost 10 seconds before saying anything. She was looking at the drive housing, Petra said. She knew what it was. She just couldn't quite make herself believe what she was looking at. What the ambassador then said, in perfect human English, because the Vethkara had always been careful students of the languages of the species they worked with, was, "This is a ship-mounted full drive." "Yes," Yara said. "You built this." "Our engineers built it, yes." A pause. "How long ago?" Yara checked her tablet. The drive architecture was first tested 31 years ago. This specific unit was installed 9 months ago. It's a 4th-generation model. She paused just briefly. The 5th generation goes into testing next month. Petra said the ambassador's expression did not change, exactly. But something behind it did. The meeting was held in a neutral conference room on the Farview platform. The room had a wide window that looked out at Jupiter and, on a clear day, at the faint arc of the Meridian Ring in the middle distance. It was not chosen by accident. Ambassador Velthera arrived with 2 aides and a protocol officer. Yara had Owen's daughter Petra, a science advisor named Dr. Lena Ford, and me, because I had asked, and because Yara was thoughtful enough to understand that I had earned a right to be in the room. Velthera was older. Of course she was. 40 years had passed for her as well. She was still tall, still carried herself with that particular Vethkara stillness that I had once found calming and now found simply familiar. When she saw me across the table, she stopped for a moment. "Delegate Solano," she said. "I'm retired," I said. "You can call me Mira." She looked at me for a long moment. Then she sat down. The formal part of the meeting followed conclave diplomatic protocols, because Yara had prepared for this carefully and knew that letting the other party set the procedural framework was a small courtesy that cost nothing and communicated confidence. Velthura stated the purpose of the visit. The conclave wished to extend its formal regret over the events of 40 years ago, to acknowledge that the decision had been reached through an incomplete understanding of humanity's nature and contribution, and to issue a formal invitation for humanity to rejoin the galactic community under a revised charter that included new provisions for what the conclave now called high-variance civilizations. She said all of this very properly. Her hands were folded on the table. Her aides did not move. Yara listened to the whole statement without interrupting. When it was done, she said, "Thank you, Ambassador. We appreciate the gesture. Before we discuss the invitation itself, we have a few questions." Of course. The three seedling species named in the original judgment, the Dorith, the Soonlai, and the Mirren Collective. What is their current developmental status? Velthira paused very briefly. They have been developing at rates that exceed standard projections. In what fields? Another small pause. Technology, primarily, and cultural integration. The Soonlai in particular have made significant advances in energy systems over the past 20 years. Yara nodded. And the conclave's current explanation for that acceleration? The room was quiet. One of Velthira's aides shifted very slightly in his seat. "The causes are still under analysis," Velthira said carefully. Yara made a small note on her tablet. "I ask because among the items transmitted to those three species in humanity's final formal communication to the conclave, the document sometimes called the parting record, were approximately 1,400 technical and cultural manuscripts, given freely. We thought it would be polite to leave something useful behind." Velthira looked at her, then at me, then back at Yara. "That document was logged as a cultural archive," she said slowly. "It was," Yara agreed. "It was also an engineering library." There was a long pause. I looked out the window at Jupiter. I had looked at Jupiter from this platform for years now, and it never looked the same twice. After a moment, Velthira said, "We were not aware of the scope of that material." "No," Yara said pleasantly. "You weren't." The conversation continued for another 3 hours. Velthira was skilled and patient and clearly very carefully briefed, and she moved through the agenda with care. But the conversation had shifted from the moment Yara mentioned the parting record, and everyone in the room knew it. At one point, Velthira asked to see the Farview platform's main operational hub. It was a reasonable request, and Yara agreed. The tour was conducted by Petra, who was good at these things, informative without being showy, factual without being cold. The hub occupied 3 levels of the station's central spine. It had overlapping shifts of nearly 1,000 operators at peak hours. It coordinated traffic across the outer solar system, the 17 colony worlds, and the Ring Habitat Network. Screens lined every wall. The room hummed with the particular low-frequency energy of a place where nothing is ever fully at rest. Velthira stood at the observation rail above the main floor and looked at it for quite a long time. Then she said, quietly, to Petra, "How many ships does humanity currently operate?" Petra was quiet for just a moment. Then she looked at her own tablet and said, "Commissioned or launched?" I was not present for that exchange. Petra described it to me later, but I was told that Ambassador Velthira did not answer, that she simply looked back at the screens below and did not say anything for a considerable time. The formal session ended with a statement from Yara that was, I thought, exactly right. She thanked the ambassador for coming. She acknowledged the conclave's expression of regret. She said that humanity valued its connections with the galaxy's civilizations and would consider the invitation to rejoin the community carefully and thoroughly, and that the Council would transmit a response within 1 standard conclave year. 1 year. Velthira received this with visible composure, though her protocol officer looked slightly surprised. As the ambassador was preparing to leave, she paused near the door and looked at me again. "You look well," she said. I am well, I said. Are you happy? She said it simply, not as a diplomatic question, but as a real one. She had always been better than most at asking real questions. I thought about it honestly. Yes, I said. I think we all are, actually, in a way we weren't before. She looked at me for another moment. I believe you, she said. And then she left. Yara and I ate dinner together in the lounge afterward. She ate quickly, the way she always did, and then sat back and looked at the stars with the particular settled expression of someone who has done a good day's work. What did you think? I asked her. I think she's smart enough to understand what she saw today, Yara said. The question is whether she's senior enough in the conclave to make anyone else understand it. And if she is, Yara turned her cup in her hands. Then we'll have another conversation in a year. And it will be a different conversation. I thought about the gavel coming down 40 years ago. I thought about the pale, even light in that chamber and the 300 faces looking somewhere above my head. Yes, I said. I imagine it will be. She smiled. You should sleep, Grandma. Tomorrow Keanu's team runs the third-generation calibration test, and you said you wanted to watch. I did say that. And after that, she said, I want your eyes on the draft response to the conclave. I'm going to say no to the membership invitation, but I want to say it in the right way. I looked at her. You've already decided? 2 weeks ago, she said. But I wanted to see her face when she understood what we built. It seemed important. She stood up and kissed the top of my head and went to bed, and I sat alone in the lounge for a while with the stars outside the window and something very quiet and very warm in my chest that it took me a moment to name. It was pride, a kind I had never felt in that conclave chamber, not in 9 years of careful, hopeful, patient work. This was different. This was the kind that comes not from being accepted, but from knowing fully, clearly, without needing anyone else to confirm it, that you were never the problem in the first place. There was a moment, 14 years into the quarantine, when the Earth Council had to make a choice. It was not a dramatic moment. There was no emergency session, no speech to a full chamber, no recording that historians have since played back as a pivot point in human destiny. It happened in a small conference room in the council building in Geneva on a Wednesday afternoon in early March, with 12 people around a table and a cup of tea going cold at someone's elbow. The choice was simple in its structure and enormous in its consequence. Option 1. Petition the conclave for review of the quarantine decision. Present new evidence, demonstrate behavioral change, submit to a formal assessment. There were legal pathways within the conclave charter that allowed this. It had never been tried, but it existed on paper. Option 2. Stop looking at the gate. I was not in that room. I was, at the time, running a technical working group at the University of Wellington, compiling everything I had observed about galactic relay architecture into a format that engineers could actually use. But I was told about the meeting years later by Counselor Dean, who had been there and who was, in his own words, terrified of what we were about to decide. They chose option 2, not unanimously. 3 of the 12 voted to try the petition process. 2 abstained. 7 voted to close the chapter and build something new. In that vote, unremarkable and unrecorded in any history that the conclave would ever see, was the moment that actually changed everything. I tell you this because what happened in the weeks and months that followed the ambassador's visit was a direct consequence of that Wednesday in March. And you need to understand where the decision came from before you can understand what it meant. The project that became known as the closing, officially designated the Topological Severance Initiative, did not begin as what it became. It began as a defensive measure. Our physicists, working on the independent drive architecture, had discovered something unexpected in the mathematics of fold space. When a ship-mounted drive interacted with the natural topological structure of local space-time, it did not merely pass through, it left a trace. A very faint one, almost unmeasurable but real, and extended over time. Those traces could accumulate into something more significant. The question our engineers began asking was not, can we use this, but rather, what does it mean? And the answer they eventually arrived at, after 11 years of increasingly careful and increasingly astonishing research, was that with sufficient drive activity concentrated in a specific configuration around a stellar system, You could alter the local topology of space-time permanently. Not destroy it, not block it with a physical barrier. Simply reshape it so gently and so completely that the fold pathways that previously connected that system to the wider network of interstellar travel simply cease to exist. It was as Dr. Lena Ford described it in the technical summary she gave to the council, like repainting a room. Afterward, the room looks different and the old color is genuinely gone, but nothing was broken and nothing hurt. The conclave's probes, which have been growing increasingly active near the heliosphere boundary in the months since the ambassador's visit, were not capable of detecting topological shifts at this scale. This was not something they had ever needed to measure, because it was not something they had ever imagined doing. That was the moment I realized just how differently we had started thinking from the civilization that had exiled us. They thought in infrastructure. Fixed points, relay gates, permanent installations at set coordinates. Their entire galactic network was built on the assumption that you create a road and then travel the road, and the road stays where you put it. We had learned, in 40 years of building everything from scratch, to think and process, and change, in the understanding that the most reliable thing in the universe is not something you lock in place, but something that can adapt. The closing was not a weapon. I want to be clear about that. It was not a statement of hostility, not a threat, not an act of retaliation for the original quarantine. Our physicists could perform it from within the system without any action that would register as aggressive on any sensor. It required no energy burst, no physical event, no moment of visible decision. What it required was patience and coordination. 18 months of patience and coordination, specifically 18 months during which approximately 400 drive-equipped ships maintained specific orbital configurations at the outer edges of the heliosphere, their drives running in a particular frequency range that our engineers call the resonance mode, gradually and permanently reshaping the topology of local space around the Sol system. While this was happening, life continued entirely normally. The Neptune drive test that Keanu's team had been working toward ran 6 months into the closing process, and it worked exactly as predicted, which meant that the range ceiling on human FTL travel was effectively removed. Keanu sent me a message from the Neptune rig that night that contained no words, just a photograph of his entire team standing in front of the drive housing, every single one of them grinning. I put in my memoirs. The conclave's probe density near the buoy tripled in the 4 months following the ambassador's visit, then doubled again 2 months after that. They were seeing the energy signatures from the resonance ships, and they could not interpret them. It would have been a mystery to their engineers, a massive, organized, low-intensity energy pattern with no identifiable function, distributed across a spherical zone at the heliosphere boundary. Not a weapon charging, not a construction project in any format they recognized. Just this slow, patient hum of ships in configuration. I tried to imagine what their analysts were reporting and found I could not. They did not have the theoretical framework to understand what they were looking at. You cannot recognize a process you have never conceived of. Yara finished the draft response to the Conclave's membership invitation 2 weeks after the ambassador returned to Conclave space. She spent 3 evenings on it and showed me each draft in turn. The first was too formal. The second was better, but too long. The third was right. It was polite. It was warm, even. It acknowledged the Conclave's history, its achievements, its genuine importance as an institution. It expressed humanity's ongoing respect for the civilizations that comprised it. It noted that humanity had, in the decades since the quarantine, developed its own systems of governance, trade, exploration, and interstellar travel, and that those systems were now fully independent and self-sustaining. And it declined the invitation, not indefinitely, and not with hostility. It said that humanity would remain open to future engagement on specific issues of mutual interest, that our doors were not closed, that the 3 seedling species in particular were welcome to make direct contact through human channels if they wished. But the formal reentry into the community, as described by the Conclave Charter, was not something humanity intended to pursue at this time. It was, Yara told me, the most careful piece of writing she had ever done. Because the most important thing it communicated was not in any of the words, it was in the tone. It was not an angry document. It was not a wounded one. It read like a letter from someone who had thought about it thoroughly, arrived at a considered conclusion, and wanted the other party to understand that the conclusion was not personal. Which it wasn't. That was the thing. That was the thing I had been trying to put into words for years, and couldn't quite. And when I read Yara's draft, I realized she had somehow managed to put into words without using the words at all. We were not rejecting the conclave. We were simply already somewhere else. The formal transmission of the response went out 4 months after the ambassador's visit, delivered via a single-use relay antenna we had constructed specifically for this communication, because our main infrastructure no longer touched the conclave's network at all, and we had no particular desire to rebuild that connection just to send one message. I watched the transmission log close on my screen in the Council Communications Archive. A blinking light, then steady, then gone. Done. On the same day, and I will admit this timing was not entirely coincidental because Yara had a specific and somewhat wicked sense of occasion. The closing completed its final resonance phase. Lena Ford sent me a message at 9:14 in the morning. It read, "The topology has settled. We've run the confirmation scans. The fold pathways from external origin points to Sol no longer exist. Hearthstone is complete. You can retire the buoy now." I forwarded the message to the council with a single line of my own, as noted. Please decommission the quarantine buoy and file it under historical infrastructure. An engineer named Sam Cole performed the decommissioning 3 days later. It took about 40 minutes. He wrote in his work log, "Unit powered down and removed from service. No anomalies noted. The Sol system gate access marker has been closed from our side. All looks good." I read that work log entry so many times in the weeks afterward that I could recite it from memory. I have thought, sometimes, about Velthira's face when she was told, about what the news would look like from where she sat, that the system she had visited, the system she had extended a formal apology to, the system whose energy signatures had been confusing her analysts for a year, had simply closed itself, that the fold pathways no longer existed. That humanity had performed some operation that her civilization's entire scientific establishment had never imagined possible, and then filed it under historical infrastructure. I did not feel triumphant thinking about this. I felt something quieter and more complicated, something that was partly satisfaction, partly sadness, and partly a kind of wonder at how completely things can change over 40 years when no one is watching them too closely. The conclave had sealed us in. We had closed the gate from our side. There is a difference between those two things, and the difference is everything. The sealed-in party is contained. They are subject to the decision of whoever put the seal there. They exist within a boundary they did not choose. The party that closes its own gate from the inside has made a choice. They have looked at what is on the other side and said, clearly and calmly, "We are choosing this. We chose this." And on the morning that Lena Ford's message arrived and Sam Cole's work log was filed and the fold pathways quietly ceased to exist, 17 human colony worlds were going about their ordinary days. The Meridian Ring's breakfast hour was in full swing. Keanu's team was running diagnostics on the 5th-generation drive. 342 human research ships were in transit between systems. A crew of 8 was preparing to depart for a star we had not yet named, in a direction the conclave had never looked. None of them marked the occasion. There was nothing to mark. It was not an ending. It was barely a chapter break. It was just a Tuesday. I finished writing these memoirs on a ship. I did not plan it that way. I had expected to finish them on the Farview platform, where I had lived for most of the past 30 years, in a lounge with a wide window and the view of Jupiter. But Yara asked me to come on the Orith First Contact mission, and I said yes because I'm old and I have learned that the correct answer to invitations from people you love is almost always yes. The ship is called the Elliott March, named for a biologist who worked on the early colony programs and died before she got to see any of them succeed. She would have liked this ship. It is fast and quiet and smells faintly of recycled air and coffee, which is the universal smell of humans doing something important in a small enclosed space. I am writing this in the ship's library, a room the size of a large closet, with a screen on one wall and a reading chair that has clearly been used so many times it has developed opinions about posture. Yara knocked on the door an hour ago to tell me we would reach the Orth system within 6 hours, and I said thank you. And she looked at what I was doing and smiled and didn't say anything else, which is one of the many ways in which she is like her mother. Let me tell you about the Orth. We found them 11 years ago, on the second survey mission to the Sculptor Dwarf, a small satellite galaxy that trails the main body of the Milky Way at a distance of about 300,000 light-years. This was, to be precise, not the galaxy we had been exiled from. It was another one. We had, in the years since the closing, extended our reach in several directions, and one of those directions was outward. The Orth are a young civilization, technically spacefaring. They have had orbital capability for about 200 years, but they have not yet developed faster-than-light travel, and their understanding of what the universe contains beyond their own star system is, by our measure, quite limited. They know there are other stars. They have a scientific consensus that some of those stars probably have planets, and a cultural tradition across most of their major societies that suggests life might exist elsewhere. But they have never encountered another species. Until us. When our survey ship first detected their transmissions, radio, still at this stage of their development, the crew spent 3 weeks simply listening before reporting back. Then it spent another 4 weeks verifying the data. Then the captain, a thoughtful woman named Grace Dillon, sent a message to the council that said, simply, "We've found people. What do we do?" The council convened. Yara, as Earth delegate, chaired the session. It lasted 3 days. What they decided, and what I consider the best decision I've seen in the 60 years of watching humans make decisions, was this: they would make no contact until they understood. Not until they had decoded a significant portion of the Ortha's languages, their primary one, and at least 2 of the major regional variants. Not until they understood the Ortha's social structures, their governing systems, their cultural taboos, their relationship with the concept of the unknown. Not until they were confident that first contact, when it came, would be on the Ortha's terms as much as possible, offered in their own language, structured around their own framework for making sense of the world, presented not as the arrival of something vast and overwhelming, but as the beginning of a conversation between equals. 8 years this took. 8 years of mission ships running silent near the Orth system's edge, with linguists and anthropologists and xenopsychologists working in rotating shifts. 8 years of listening, learning, mapping, preparing. Yara told me once that there were moments during those 8 years when members of the council wanted to move faster, when the argument was made that we were delaying something wonderful. And she had responded every time with the same question: wonderful for whom? I have thought about that question a great deal. I thought about it in the conclave chamber, the day of the verdict, when I realized that the community that had welcomed us 60 years earlier had always seen our admission as a gift from them to us. A wonderful thing they were doing for humanity. And because it was their wonderful thing, they had always retained the right to take it back. I thought about the Dorith and the Soonlai and the Mirren Collective, the seedling species the conclave had been mentoring, carefully, at the conclave's pace, toward the conclave's idea of proper development. The wonderful thing the conclave was doing for them. I thought about the 1,400 documents in the parting record, left freely. No strings, no schedule, no plan for what the recipient should do with them or become because of them. 8 years of silence. And then first contact in the Ortha's own language, on their terms, starting with a question instead of an announcement. That is not how the conclave would have done it. That is not how we would have done it 60 years ago, either. We have learned some things. The ship slows. I can feel it in the way the background hum of the drive changes, a slight shift in frequency, like a note settling. 6 hours, Yara said. And that was just over an hour ago, which means either she underestimated or the navigators have done something clever. I closed my writing file and walked down the corridor to the observation deck, where about 15 people have gathered near the forward window. They are quiet in the way that people are quiet when they know something remarkable is about to happen and they don't want to fill the moment with noise. Dr. Noel Castillo, the lead linguist on the mission, is standing near the front. He is 44 years old and has spent the last 8 years doing almost nothing except learning Orith languages. And he has the particular look of someone who has devoted himself so completely to understanding something that it has become part of how he thinks. He nods at me when I come in. The star resolves first, a warm yellow star, slightly smaller than Sol, burning quietly at the center of a system with 6 planets. Then the third planet comes into focus, blue-green, cloud-streaked, very beautiful. Someone near the back says softly, "There they are. There is news, received in the past week via our deep space relay, that the Conclave has made a formal announcement crediting its own mentorship program for the accelerated development of the Sunlai. The Sunlai have achieved independent FDL travel. The Conclave is presenting this as evidence of the success of their guidance program. The parting record is not mentioned. Yara had forwarded me the announcement with a single note. The math doesn't work on their timeline. But let them have it. I agree. Let them have it. The Sunlai are flying between stars. Whatever they do next, they will do it under their own power. Dr. Castillo is going over his notes. The first contact message has been prepared, reviewed, and refined over 11 months. It is in primary Orith, which is a tonal language with a complex verb aspect system and a strong cultural emphasis on questions over statements. The message begins with a greeting. It acknowledges that we are strangers. It says that we come from a distant star. It says we have been listening for a long time and learning because we wanted to meet them properly. Then it asks, is now a good time? Noel says that is the closest Orith equivalent for the concept. Is now a good time? Not we are here, or we have arrived, or attention. Contact has been initiated. Is now a good time? I think it is the right beginning. I think it is a beginning we could not have managed 60 years ago, before we were exiled, before we spent 40 years building alone, before we learned that the most powerful thing you can offer another species is not your technology or your knowledge or even your friendship. It is the willingness to wait until they are ready. Yara comes and stands beside me. She is looking at the planet with the expression she gets when she is thinking carefully, which she almost always is. After a moment, she says, the message goes out in 4 hours. Are you nervous? I ask. No, she says. Are you? I think about it honestly. No, I say. I am curious. She nods. That is the right answer. She knows it, and I know it. I look at the planet. I think about Mum watching that first broadcast in her school classroom in Wellington, the whole room going silent, and then loud, the sense that everything had changed. I think about standing at the podium for 11 minutes while the vote was already counted. I think about Owen's tablet on the table in the delegation suite, with a project title and a budget and a list of names I didn't know yet. I think about Sam Cole's work log. All looks good. And I think about something I wrote late one night on the Farview platform, in the early drafts of these memoirs, a line I kept coming back to and revising and eventually decided to leave as it was because the simple version was the true version. I had written, they thought exile was a punishment, but humanity has always done its best work alone, in the dark, with no one watching. The galaxy didn't exile us. It just gave us a head start. I look at the blue-green planet. I look at the warm yellow star. Below us, on that planet, a civilization is going about its ordinary day. Some of them are looking up, as civilizations always do, and wondering if they are alone. Some of them are going to find out today that they are not, and it will be the most significant moment in their history. And we're going to try very hard to make sure they feel, in that moment, not small and not overwhelmed and not subject to someone else's plan for them. We're going to try to make sure they feel, simply, that they have been heard. The star outside the window burns quietly. The planet turns. Noel looks up from his notes and nods. For hours. We are ready.